This video is sponsored by Wren. Hey everybody, and welcome back to my YouTube channel. My name is Jan, also known as Sydney Plant Guy, and I love growing large aeroids indoors. We're back with Plant Spotlight, and today's focus is on Monstera siltepecana, El Salvador. As always, I'm going to show you the journey the plant and I have been through together. I've had this plant for almost 3 years, so I've had a lot of time to make experiences and learnings with this plant. So I'll then later on share any tips and tricks with you that I know about this specific species. But before we get into the video, I would love to talk to you about the sponsor of this video, Wren. Wren is a simple and effective way to make a difference in the climate crisis. We've been hit with a lot of bushfires and flooding in Australia like we've never experienced before. So climate crisis isn't something you just hear about in the news anymore. It's something that surrounds us. It's something that impacts all of us. I would consider myself an environmentally conscious person, but these days it's so hard to really assess what environmental impact your every step might have. There are a few things that I did to change my environmental footprint that came quite easy to me. Things like not owning a car or not eating any meat. Not everything is as easy to change. For example, I have family overseas in Europe and I love to visit them as often as I can. But long-haul flights emit a lot of carbon, so it's not really environmentally friendly to take long-haul flights. Am I going to stop doing it? Absolutely not. But I wish there was a way for me to offset the carbon emissions I have caused by traveling overseas. Well, Wren has the solution. Essentially, Wren does 3 things. First, it helps you calculate your environmental footprint through a questionnaire asking you about your lifestyle and habits. Afterwards, it gives you tips and tricks on how you can already reduce your carbon emissions. And then lastly, it helps you offset any further carbon emissions. And Wren does that by giving you the ability to support projects like tree plantings and rainforest protection. As a plant person, I love that Wren is protecting the Amazon rainforest. They do that by providing locals with software and drones so that they can actually fly drones and monitor any illegal deforestation and then alarm authorities straight away. How cool is that? And the best thing is, every month, Wren will send you an update showing you exactly how your money was used to offset any emissions. Thank you, Wren, for protecting the planet and sponsoring this video. If you would like to offset your carbon emissions using Wren, you can use the link in the description below. And the first 100 people using the link below will have an extra 10 trees planted in their name. Alrighty, let's go back to the Monstera. Let's get right into it. As I mentioned, I've got this plant about 3 years ago, and I've got it the same day I purchased my varicosum and my Milano. So that was definitely a good day in my plant parent life. So I've got it in January 2020 as this tiny little cutting. I popped it on a moss pole straight away, and I actually had a secondary cutting gifted by a friend at the same time. So I popped it on the back of the moss pole. So that's why you can see on that photo at the front, that's a little plant that I got in January 2020. And that's really the plant that took off. The cutting in the back probably wasn't the smartest idea to put it on the back of the moss pole, but that never really thrived. So I eventually just started cutting it up and took it off the moss pole. So really the plant that you see on here right now is that plant at the front, and that's the one that we're going to focus on for today. So it started growing quite quickly. So within just 3 months, it really took to the moss pole and it started climbing up that moss pole, and I saw a very decent increase in leaf size. And it really just kept going from there. It was such an easy plant to take care of straight from the beginning. So even though I didn't have that much experience back then, it was a great plant to learn a lot about moss poles, moss pole extensions, and so on. So in September 2020, you can see that it has continuously climbed up a moss pole and a continuously increased in leaf size. And you can also see that I put like a little extension on that pole already back then. And back then I wasn't that regimented with my poles. Right now, all of my poles are 90 centimeters in height and 6 centimeters in diameter. And I just chuck 2 on top, and then I chop it and chuck another one on top. So I keep just going in 90 centimeter increments. Back then I just kind of made moss poles of any size, any length, and I just started extending them. But what that means is that by the time I got this one to 180 centimeters, the pole might be made out of 3 or 4 segments, which means that, you know, the more segments you've got, the more joints between poles you've got. The more joints you've got, the less structural integrity. So I would recommend just sticking to like one size of pole and just, you know, going with it rather than just keep doing a lot of small extensions. It's just ultimately gonna impact the structural integrity of your moss pole. Alrighty, so then in October 2020, it already reached the top of its extension. And that's when I noticed, I was like, well, I can't really extend it again, then it would be too big. So that's where I realized I need to chop it. Back then, I haven't really tried my chop and extends before. So back then, I didn't do a chop and extend. I actually chopped the top part off and I continued growing the bottom part. So you can see that over here in December, I'm holding the top part. That top part, I actually got rid of the whole moss pole and I just took single node cuttings from it. I have a few single node cuttings in there already. They came off that second shoot on the back of the moss pole. And then I'm actually going to keep the bottom part of my moss pole and I re-extended that. So in February 2021, that's where you can see that I re-extended that bottom part of the pole. And what I did with all of the other single node cuttings, I put them back in the bottom of the pot. So to create a lush pot instead. Now, 100%, if you look at February 2021 compared to October 2020, the plant has like gone backwards in appearance, in my opinion, right? Like I much preferred the aesthetics of the plant in October 2020 than to February 2021, but I knew what I had in mind. I wanted to create not a pole with one vine going up. I wanted to have 4, 5, 6, 7 different vines on that one pole and just create a really, really lush plant. So I know it's going to look terrible like not terrible, but it's not going to look its best for a few months. I know that eventually it will get there. So that is totally normal. It's like I like to compare it to bonsais actually, right? Like, I mean, if you want to grow a bonsai, ideally, you would want to continuously make it grow. But the biggest part about growing bonsais is actually pruning them and cutting them back. You do need to cut them back so that they look empty and ugly again. But when they reshoot, that's where the magic happens, right? So I take a similar approach with my indoor plants. Sometimes to achieve a certain goal that I have in mind aesthetically, in the long run, I just need to sacrifice a little bit of aesthetics in the short run. And that's okay. I have so many plants. Some of them are always looking great, but they don't all need to be looking their best at all times. Anyway, let's keep going with the journey. In May 2021, it reached the top of its extension again, and it actually started growing really large leaves, and it gave me my very first fenestration. So I was actually surprised at how long it took for it to give me its first fenestration. The leaf size was already quite large, and the fenestration was tiny. I would have expected it to happen much quicker. And then by August 2021, so this is really what I was referring to with making a lush pole. All of these cuttings that I put at the bottom of the pole at the beginning of the year have now continued climbing up that pole and really completely hide the moss pole in itself. That's the look that I'm aiming for. I don't want to see the moss pole. The moss pole is not the beautiful looking part. I want the moss pole to be covered in leaves. So I absolutely loved the plant at that stage, and I think it was well worth it going through all of that chopping and resetting the plant a little bit to create that sort of nice look. Looking at that photo, let me also address the difference between Monstera siltepecana and Monstera siltepecana El Salvador. So on that photo, I showed them side by side. The actual regular form is also over here. So I've had them for approximately the same amount of time. Actually, I had the regular form for longer, and for the longest time, they were also growing right next to each other. So they had very similar conditions. The siltepecana regular form has much less silver. Like, yes, if you look at it in isolation, it actually has a little bit of silver marking, and the silver markings get a little bit more intense if you give it more light exposure. But if you look at it next to the El Salvador, you don't really see the silver because the El Salvador has much, much more silver in it. The regular siltepecana also doesn't increase in leaf size as quickly. After 3 years, the siltepecana still hasn't really given me any decent leaf size. I know that it can grow quite large in nature. I just don't know how realistic it is for that plant to actually mature in my indoor environment. But to be really fair, neither of these plants have really been getting the prime spots because, yes, there were plants that I had very initially in my plant journey. And then as I expanded my collection, I got other plants that I actually preferred. The other difference as well is that the siltepecana seems to be fenestrating much more readily and much earlier on. So this siltepecana, if you look at the top over here, has actually quite a lot of fenestrations on leaves that are only about this size even. Whereas this plant took much longer and the leaves had to get much bigger before they actually started showing any signs of fenestrations. Of course, if you just look at one or the other, it might be a little bit hard to assess which one of the two it is. But if you look at them next to each other, it's going to be really, really clear which one is the El Salvador. It's always the one that's larger with more silver, and which one is the regular form. It's more green, much smaller in leaf size. All right, moving on. By November 2021, it reached the top of its moss pole, at least that tallest vine reached the top of its moss pole, but that vine had about a moss pole of a head start compared to all of the other cuttings that are put around the base of the pot. So I didn't want to do a chop and extend, because I'll essentially, when I chop the top off and I pot it up and I re-extend it, I would lose most of the cuttings. All the cuttings at the bottom would be so small, they would have a really, really hard time going through the chop and extend. So I did not want to do the chop and extend just yet. Instead, I decided to take that top vine and actually start trailing it down instead of letting it continuously climb up, just giving the rest of the vines a bit of time to catch up and also get to the top of the pole. I reckon at that time there was about 7 to 8 cuttings or vines on that one pole. Now, when you try and train a plant down the moss pole, that goes against its natural growth pattern, and it will definitely decrease in leaf size for you. But that was okay. All I wanted to do is I really wanted to get it down the pole and then back up the pole, just so it's even with all the other ones. That's also a great way of actually you multiplying your plant eventually without cutting it then and there. If you keep doing it up and down, once you do the chop and extend, you basically now turned one long vine into a lot of smaller vines. Also, something I wanted to mention over here is you can see that the leaf size has gotten really, really big there in November 21, but it doesn't show me many fenestrations. So at that time, I didn't give it much light actually, or like obviously it got sufficient light, otherwise it wouldn't have grown and definitely wouldn't have grown large leaves. But I didn't give it a lot of light compared to what I do right now. So it currently gets a little more light than it did back then. And the leaf size has actually decreased, but it gave me fenestrations instead. So what I've noticed is lower light conditions seem to be actually creating larger leaves, but with less fenestrations. High light intensity is giving you smaller leaves, but with more fenestrations. So I now put it somewhere in between. So hopefully it's going to give me nice large leaves, but also a lot of fenestrations. Time will tell. Late December 2021, I then gave it a chop and extend. I have the video up on here. So I take the top cutting, I pot the top cutting back up, I re-extend the top cutting, and that's the part I'm going to continue growing. The bottom part I then usually sell or swap to, expand my collection with other plants that I don't already have. Of course, the bottom part is also going to reshoot, so you could totally re-extend it and then grow 2 of the same kind, but space is precious, and I definitely don't want to grow 2 of the same species. If I would much rather swap it and grow something different instead. Alrighty. By January 2022, you can see that that plant recovered so incredibly quickly from the chop and extend. Just a month after the chop and extend, you can see that that main vine is almost reaching the top of the pole again. So it can easily grow like a leaf a week in prime season in summer. Keep in mind, I'm in the southern hemisphere. So December, January, February is like our prime growing season. So it can grow really, really quickly. And I specifically like this photo because it's actually the same 4 plants that I got that very first day on that first photo that I showed you. So it's those 4 plants 2 years later. So they've all grown quite large in those 2 years. So by February 2022, it definitely reached the top of its moss pole again, but just that main vine. I think by now there was like 3 or 4 or 5 on there. Not all of them made it through to the extension. So again, I didn't want to chop and extend it again. I can't chop and extend it every 2 months or so. So I wanted to train that top vine back down again. To train it down the moss pole, really, I use twine. So I take the stem, I slightly bend it down. Ideally, you do it when the plant is a bit dehydrated, not right after watering. And then I just use twine to slowly tie it to the moss pole. And then every day I make it a little bit tighter until the stem actually reaches the moss pole and can attach itself to. And then I move on to the next growth and so on. But again, I don't necessarily recommend it. You could also totally just take a top cutting, propagate it, and then pop it back in the pot when you do the next chop and extend anyway. I just wanted to experiment with it, but honestly, I don't necessarily like bending it down, specifically not if the stem is actually quite thick. Then I have a lack of photos between February and June. Sorry for that. But in June, it reached the top of its moss pole again, and I gave it another chop and extend. I actually recorded that. It was my second ever YouTube video. where I did that chop and extend of my Monstera siltepecana El Salvador. And this is the result of that latest chop and extend. So the first moss pole ends over here. So everything down used to be the top of the moss pole. I then potted it up, and everything from here upwards is new growth since June. After the chop and extend, I really wanted to give it a little bit more light. So as I mentioned earlier, it used to live in a bit of a darker corner because I just don't have enough prime spots for all of my plants. So some just have to take a back seat. This one took a back seat. It really didn't mind it. It actually grew really large leaves, but it didn't give me any fenestrations. So then after the chop and extend, gave it quite a lot of sun from my northwest facing balcony window. And since then, it has given me so many fenestrations and very consistently as well. It's still increasing in leaf size, but it's actually, these are smaller leaves than they were before. I mean, do I have, like these ones, for example, over here, you can see how large these leaves were. That was the top of the old pole when it got a little bit less light compared to these ones now. Much smaller, but has nicer fenestrations. Okay, so that's basically the main thing I learned about this plant, that leaf size and fenestration is not necessarily correlating. So it's not the larger the leaf, the more likely it's going to fenestrate. It seems to be more tied to light exposure, but light exposure doesn't seem to be directly tied to the size of the leaf. At least in my experiences, I could be completely wrong, but I mean, that's all I can talk to you about, my experiences. Apart from that, it's actually really, really low maintenance. It's a Monstera, so it can tolerate drying out a little bit more than a velvet philodendron, for example. I still try and keep the moss pole moist at all times, and I do that by watering between 1 to 2 times a week using my bottle upside down water technique. And with every watering, or at least once a week when I water, I also put liquid nutrients, GT Australia Foliage Focus, in my water, 5 milliliters per liter of water. I'm not super worried about this drying out a little bit though. These Monstera roots can usually tolerate drying out and then being rehydrated a little bit better than a philodendron, but you absolutely don't have to, right? When you read these things, it's like Monstera roots should dry out in between watering. Well, that's not necessarily true to where they grow in nature. I think it's just a tip that a lot of people, and it's a good tip, don't get me wrong. It's more a tip that people give others because yes, they're more tolerant to drying out than overwatering. That doesn't mean that they actually love drying out. These plants usually grow in very humid rainforest environments, and it rains, and when it's 90% humidity, nothing ever really dries out. So yes, they can tolerate drying out, but I don't think it's necessarily desirable. But if you don't have enough time, or every now and then you forget to keep on top of your pole maintenance, then I think this is a plant that will be okay with that. It will forgive you. It's in my regular aeroid mix in a 20 centimeter pot, and it's on a 6 centimeter moss pole with a 180 centimeter height. Now, if I combine all of the chop and extends that it would have had throughout the years, I reckon this plant, I don't know exactly because I did some random sized poles in between, but I reckon this plant overall would be around 4 meters tall, or would have climbed up 4 meters of moss pole at this stage to kind of get to that level of maturity. Of course, it doesn't mean that you need 4 meters worth of moss pole. If you can provide it with better conditions, more light, higher humidity, warmer temperatures by growing it in the greenhouse, for example, then you might be able to grow this to maturity much faster. But I'm limited by an indoor environment, so I think, you know, I can't compete with the perfect conditions that some people might have in their greenhouse. But what I can do is I can supplement all of that by just keep going through chop and extends and giving the plant just a little bit more height to grow. As I said, yep, definitely prefers the warmer temperatures. It loves the summer months, and it's going to grow really, really fast, I reckon, over the next couple of months. I'm expecting this to really explode in growth as we are fast approaching summer. So it loves the warmer temperatures. It loves higher humidity as well, but it also can totally tolerate lower humidity. So this plant is in my living area where I don't actually control the humidity. So it can range between 30% on a really dry day. I could also be up to 80–90% if it's been raining for weeks non-stop. So it can tolerate these fluctuations. It can tolerate some drier conditions, but ultimately these plants that are native to a tropical climate usually prefer warmer temperatures and higher humidity. So at least you're going to get the best out of them if those are the conditions that you can provide it with. It does seem to be losing some of the silver markings as it matures, so I'm not too sure if that's something that you like, but if you don't want it to lose the silver markings, then you could just give it access to a little bit less light, and then it will hold on to these silver markings. Like these leaves still had a lot of silver markings, even though they were quite large in leaf size, whereas these ones, now they have lots of fenestrations and starting to mature a little bit more, I feel like the silver is fading. So it could also be because of the light exposure. I don't know, just my observations. Yeah, I think that's really all I've got to say about this plant. Again, nothing special with this plant in particular. All of my plants pretty much follow the same care routine and they're in a very similar environment. But what I really thought was interesting about this plant is that correlation between leaf size and fenestration, and that it's not really a correlation overall. I hope I inspire you to maybe pick one of those plants up if available in your country and grow it. It's definitely one of my favorite Monsteras, so I absolutely love having this in my collection, and I'm excited to see what it can grow into over the next few years. If you like this video, I reckon you'll love my plant spotlight on my Monstera Adansonia, the one that's kind of in the foreground over here. So I'll link that here for you guys. Please feel free to check it out, like, subscribe, and leave a nice comment, and I'll see you in my next video. Bye.